The red and blue lights of the police cruiser reflected off the dark asphalt, illuminating the scene like a pulsating beacon in the night. Officers Rachel Martinez and Mike Johnson approached the idling vehicle cautiously. Rachel held her flashlight steady, its beam cutting through the faint mist curling up from the cold ground. She could feel the tension in the air. Routine stops were rarely as routine as they sounded. As Mike leaned toward the driver's window, the figure inside turned their head slowly. Rachel caught a glimpse of their face in the dim light and immediately froze. Her heart skipped a beat, then began pounding like a drum in her chest. Mike's hand hovered near his holstered weapon as his mouth fell slightly open in disbelief. "Rachel," his voice was barely above a whisper. She couldn't take her eyes off the driver's face. It was impossible. It made no sense. The person sitting behind the wheel wasn't just anyone. They were someone the entire world knew, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Someone who couldn't be there. The driver smiled faintly and spoke a single sentence that sent a chill down both officers' spines. "What happens next is up to you." Earlier that evening, the small town of Brookhaven was settling into its usual quiet rhythm. Families were winding down after dinner, the corner diner was serving pie and coffee to its regulars, and the local high school's football field buzzed with the cheers of a Friday night game. Rachel and Mike had drawn the short straw on patrol duty, which meant another night of cruising through sleepy neighborhoods and monitoring mostly empty streets. Rachel adjusted the volume on the radio, hoping to drown out the awkward silence that had settled between her and Mike. They'd been partners for 2 years, but she still couldn't read him sometimes. He was one of those strong, silent types, always professional, rarely personal. "You know," Rachel said, trying to make conversation, "if we get through this shift without a single call, I'll finally believe we're living in the most boring town in America." Mike chuckled lightly, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "Boring isn't so bad. Beats trouble." "True," Rachel replied. "But a little excitement wouldn't hurt." Moments later, as if on cue, a black sedan sped past them, running a red light at the intersection. Rachel's eyes lit up. "Well, there's your excitement." Mike flipped on the lights and siren, and they began following the vehicle. The car didn't accelerate or attempt to flee. It merely slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. It was almost too cooperative. "Guess they knew they were caught," Mike muttered, pulling the cruiser to a stop a few feet behind the car. Rachel grabbed the flashlight and glanced at her partner. "You taking lead?" "Yeah," he said, stepping out of the car. "Let's see what we've got." The two officers approached the vehicle, their footsteps crunching on the gravel shoulder. Rachel's flashlight beam illuminated the license plate, the rear window, and finally the outline of the driver. The figure's hands were resting on the steering wheel, as though they'd been through this drill before. Mike tapped on the driver's side window. "Good evening. License and registration, please." The driver turned their head, and Rachel's world tilted on its axis. She knew that face, had seen it 1,000 times on TV, in newspapers, and even on the walls of her own family's home. It was the face of someone who had been presumed dead for years. The face of someone whose identity was impossible to mistake. Earlier in the day, Rachel's shift had begun as uneventfully as ever. She'd stopped by the station's break room for her third cup of coffee, exchanged the usual pleasantries with the desk sergeant, and headed out to meet Mike in the parking lot. "You hear about that big case in Chicago?" Mike had asked as they climbed into the cruiser. "Which one?" Rachel had replied, her tone dismissive. "There's always a big case in Chicago. This one's different," he said. "It's about," he'd paused, glancing at her sideways. "Never mind. It's not our problem." Rachel had rolled her eyes. Mike had a knack for dropping half a story and then clamming up, leaving her to piece it together later. She decided not to press him, figuring he'd spill the details eventually. The day had dragged on, with nothing but routine traffic checks and a noise complaint at a local bar to keep them busy. Rachel had started counting down the hours until her shift ended, dreaming of curling up with her dog and a good book. Then the black sedan had appeared, and everything had changed. Now, standing beside the driver's window, Rachel could feel her pulse racing. She wanted to say something, to ask the million questions swirling in her mind, but her throat felt like it had closed up. The driver's calm demeanor only made the situation more surreal. Mike broke the silence, his voice unusually stern. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." The driver tilted their head, studying Mike with a faint smile. "Are you sure about that?" Rachel took a step closer, her hand instinctively moving to her own holster. "Sir, step out of the vehicle," she repeated, her voice firmer than she felt. The driver sighed, as though the request were an inconvenience, and opened the door. As they stepped out, the interior light illuminated their face fully. There was no doubt left in Rachel's mind. It was them. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be," the driver said, their voice smooth and unhurried. "You're already asking the wrong questions." "What's that supposed to mean?" Mike asked, his hand tightening on his weapon. The driver glanced between the two officers, their expression unreadable. "You'll find out soon enough." Rachel felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The way the driver spoke, the way they carried themselves, it was as though they were in control of the entire situation, even as they stood with two officers pointing flashlights at them. The radio in the cruiser crackled to life, breaking the tension for a brief moment. Rachel's mind raced. Who was this person, really? And what were they doing here, in Brookhaven, on a quiet Friday night? She didn't have long to think. The driver suddenly reached into their jacket, and everything happened at once. Rachel's instinct screamed at her to act, but she hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough for the situation to spiral into chaos. Rachel's flashlight beam darted to the driver's hand as it disappeared into their jacket. Her fingers brushed against the grip of her weapon, but something about the driver's movements stopped her from drawing it outright. It wasn't the erratic, desperate motion of someone reaching for a weapon. It was slow, deliberate, measured. "Stop!" Mike barked, taking a step back, his gun half-drawn. The driver froze mid-motion, then slowly pulled their hand out. In it, they held a folded piece of paper. Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her adrenaline still surging. Mike didn't lower his guard, his voice sharp. "What's in your hand?" The driver unfolded the paper and held it out, offering no explanation. The faint light from the street lamp revealed it to be a handwritten note. Rachel hesitated before stepping forward and taking it. The words scrawled across the page were simple but chilling. "You've been chosen to know the truth." Rachel blinked, the cryptic message making no sense. "What truth? What does this mean?" The driver smiled faintly. "Everything you think you know about me, and about this world, is a lie." Mike's patience snapped. "All right, enough games. Hands where I can see them, and get against the car." The driver didn't resist, but as Mike guided them to the side of the vehicle, they spoke again, their voice eerily calm. "You're making a mistake. The questions you're asking are the wrong ones. Focus on why I'm here, not on who I am." Rachel's heart pounded. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this situation felt routine anymore. She glanced at the note again, the words haunting her. Her mind wrestled with the impossible. This person was supposed to be dead. There'd been news reports, memorials, even conspiracy theories about their disappearance. But none of it explained why they were standing here, alive and well, on a quiet road in Brookhaven. "Rachel," Mike called, snapping her out of her thoughts. "Run the plates. I want to know everything about this car." She nodded, retreating to the cruiser. Her hands shook as she entered the license plate into the database. The system processed for a moment before the results popped up on the screen. Her stomach dropped. The car was registered to someone else entirely, a woman in Chicago. No record of a sale, no reported theft. Nothing about this made sense. Rachel grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Martinez. I need you to confirm a plate for me. Could be a stolen vehicle." "Copy that, Martinez," the voice crackled back. "Send it over." She relayed the information, trying to steady her breathing. As she waited for a response, she glanced back at Mike, who was patting the driver down. They stood still, offering no resistance, as though they weren't concerned in the slightest about being detained. The radio buzzed again. "Martinez, we've got something weird here. That plate comes back clean, registered to a Michelle Harper in Chicago, Illinois. No reported theft or anything unusual." Rachel frowned. "Thanks, dispatch. Can you run the driver's license once we have it?" "Affirmative." She stepped out of the cruiser and walked back to Mike, who had just pulled a wallet from the driver's pocket. He opened it, revealing an ID card. Rachel's breath hitched as she read the name. It was them. The name on the card matched the face in front of her. The driver was who they appeared to be, or at least they had the ID to prove it. Mike muttered under his breath, disbelief etched across his face. "This can't be real." The driver turned their head slightly, addressing Rachel. "It's real. Every part of it. But that's not what matters." Rachel's voice was firm, though her hands betrayed her nerves as they clutched the note. Then tell us what does matter. The driver looked at her, their expression softening. Do you believe in second chances, Officer Martinez? Rachel blinked, caught off guard by the question. What does that have to do with anything? Everything, the driver said simply. Hours earlier, Rachel had been in a much lighter mood, joking with Mike about the mundane nature of their town. They'd been partners long enough to settle into a comfortable rhythm, even if they didn't always see eye to eye. Rachel was the optimist, always looking for the good in people. Mike, on the other hand, was pragmatic to the point of cynicism. He'd seen too many people lie, too many situations turn ugly, to take anything at face value. You're too trusting, he told her once during a coffee break. It's not a bad thing, but out here, it could get you hurt. She'd brushed it off at the time, confident in her instincts. But now, standing face to face with someone who defied logic, she wondered if Mike had been right all along. What are we going to do? She asked, her voice low enough that only Mike could hear. Procedure, he replied, though he didn't sound convinced himself. We treat this like any other stop. Get their statement, bring them in if necessary. And if it's not like any other stop? Mike gave her a look that said he didn't have the answer. One step at a time. Rachel nodded, swallowing hard. She looked back at the driver, who was now leaning casually against the hood of their car, their demeanor unsettlingly calm. Whoever they were, whatever they were, this was far from over. The tension thickened as Rachel and Mike exchanged a glance. Rachel's mind raced with questions she couldn't yet ask. Before she could speak, the radio buzzed again, cutting through the silence. Martinez, we've got a situation, dispatch said, their tone urgent. You need to bring that driver in. Immediately. Rachel's eyes widened. Why? What's going on? There was a pause before dispatch replied, their voice grim. The feds just called us. They want that person in custody, no questions asked. And Martinez, they said not to let them out of your sight. Rachel's hand tightened around the radio as a chill ran down her spine. What had they just walked into? Rachel lowered the radio slowly, her mind spinning. The federal government wanted this person in custody? Why? The calm demeanor of the driver suddenly seemed more unsettling, as if they knew exactly what was happening. Mike caught her expression and stepped closer. What did dispatch say? Her voice was steady despite the storm of questions in her mind. The feds want them in custody. They don't want us letting them out of our sight. Mike's jaw tightened. That's not routine. Not even close. The driver, still leaning against the hood of the car, tilted their head slightly, clearly picking up on their exchange. They called you already, didn't they? Their voice was calm, almost amused. Rachel exchanged a glance with Mike before stepping forward. You're under arrest. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. The driver didn't resist. This won't go the way you think, they said quietly as Mike cuffed their wrists. Save it, Mike muttered, guiding them toward the cruiser. As they secured the driver in the back seat, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she and Mike were being pulled into something much larger than themselves. She didn't know if they were ready for it. The ride back to the station was tense and eerily quiet. Rachel drove while Mike sat in the passenger seat, glancing back at the driver every few moments. They sat perfectly still, their gaze fixed out the window, their expression unreadable. Who are you really? Rachel finally asked, breaking the silence. You already know the answer, the driver replied, not looking at her. No, she shot back, gripping the wheel tighter. I know who you look like. But that doesn't explain how you're here or why the feds are involved. The driver smiled faintly. You're asking the right questions now. Mike turned sharply in his seat. Enough with the cryptic answers. What's going on? Why do they want you? The driver finally met his eyes, their gaze steady. You're both good officers. Honest. I wouldn't have chosen you otherwise. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. Chosen us? For what? Before the driver could respond, the radio crackled again. Brookhaven PD, this is dispatch. Be advised, federal agents are en route to your station. ETA 10 minutes. Rachel's grip on the wheel tightened. Copy that, dispatch. She glanced at Mike. This just keeps getting worse. Mike nodded grimly. We should have called in backup the second we saw them. As they pulled into the station parking lot, the driver broke their silence again. When they come for me, don't let them take everything I have. Rachel glanced at them in the rearview mirror. What are you talking about? You'll understand soon, the driver said, their tone somber. Mike opened his door and stepped out, moving to retrieve the driver. Rachel followed, her instincts screaming that something was about to go wrong. As they walked into the station with the driver between them, the air seemed to shift. Officers milling about the lobby glanced up, their conversations trailing off as they took in the sight of the cuffed individual. Whispers began to ripple through the room. Is that who I think it is? No way. That's impossible. Shouldn't they be? The buzz was cut short by the arrival of 3 black SUVs pulling into the parking lot, their headlights cutting through the dim evening light. Rachel and Mike exchanged uneasy glances. Feds, Mike muttered. The vehicles came to a halt, and several men and women in dark suits stepped out. One of them, a tall man with a sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes, strode toward them with purpose. He flashed his badge without a word, his expression cold. I'm Special Agent Carter, he said briskly. We're here for the detainee. Rachel folded her arms, standing her ground. They're in custody. We haven't even processed them yet. That won't be necessary, Carter replied. This is a federal matter now. Mike stepped forward, his tone firm. What's going on? Who is this person, and why is this so urgent? Carter's jaw tightened. You don't need to know. Hand them over. Rachel could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. With all due respect, Agent, we deserve to know what we're dealing with here. We were the ones who stopped them. Carter took a step closer, his voice dropping to a warning tone. Officer, this isn't a debate. You'll transfer custody now, or there will be consequences. The driver, still standing between Rachel and Mike, suddenly spoke up. They don't know everything yet, Agent Carter. But they will. Carter's expression darkened. Quiet. Rachel's gut told her to trust her instincts, even as every protocol in the book told her to comply. Something about the way Carter and his team operated felt off. Too secretive, too aggressive. Mike leaned closer to her, speaking in a low voice. This doesn't feel right. Before Rachel could respond, the driver turned to her, their expression unusually serious. Officer Martinez, if you hand me over now, you'll never know the truth. But if you keep me here, you'll have to face it. Rachel froze, her mind racing. Carter's voice broke through her thoughts. You have 10 seconds to comply. Just as Rachel was about to respond, the station's power abruptly went out. The lights flickered once before plunging the room into darkness. A collective gasp rippled through the building as officers reached for their flashlights and weapons. Stay where you are. Carter barked, his voice cutting through the confusion. Rachel instinctively grabbed her flashlight, her beam sweeping across the room. The driver was no longer standing between her and Mike. They had vanished. Chaos erupted in the station as officers scrambled to make sense of the sudden blackout and the driver's disappearance. Flashlights flickered through the darkness, illuminating wide-eyed faces and half-drawn weapons. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she instinctively reached for her sidearm. Where did they go? Mike shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. Rachel's flashlight swept across the empty space where the driver had been standing moments ago. There was no sign of movement, just shadows and confusion. Her instinct screamed that this was no ordinary escape. Check the exits. Carter barked at his team, his usually cold demeanor cracking under the pressure. Nobody leaves this building. Rachel turned to Mike, her voice low and urgent. This doesn't make sense. They were cuffed. There's no way they could have just disappeared. Unless someone helped them, Mike replied, his jaw tight. His eyes darted toward the federal agents, suspicion etched across his face. Carter seemed to sense their unease. Officers, we need full cooperation. This is a matter of national security. Rachel stepped forward, her flashlight fixed on Carter. What aren't you telling us? Who is this person? And how did they manage to vanish under our watch? Carter hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Rachel to catch it. That's classified, he said, his voice clipped. Classified. Rachel repeated, her frustration boiling over. They were in our custody. We deserve answers. Before Carter could respond, a faint hum filled the air, growing louder by the second. The sound was low and vibrating, like machinery coming to life. Rachel turned toward the source, her flashlight cutting through the darkened hallway that led to the evidence room. What is that? Mike asked, his hand resting on his weapon. Rachel didn't answer. Instead, She began walking toward the sound, her steps cautious but determined. Mike followed close behind, his flashlight casting jittery shadows on the walls. The hum grew louder as they approached the evidence room door, which stood slightly ajar. Rachel exchanged a glance with Mike, then pushed the door open with the barrel of her gun. The room was empty, but the hum was louder than ever. Her flashlight landed on a peculiar device sitting on the table in the center of the room. It was small, metallic, and unlike anything she'd ever seen, sleek with glowing blue lines running along its surface. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered, his eyes wide. Rachel stepped closer, her curiosity overpowering her fear. The device emitted a soft pulse of light, as if responding to their presence. She reached out to touch it, but stopped when Mike grabbed her arm. "Don't," he said firmly. "We don't know what it is." Before they could decide their next move, the device emitted a high-pitched beep. The hum stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, a holographic image flickered to life above the device, a projection of the driver's face. Rachel and Mike froze, their eyes fixed on the image. The driver's expression was calm, almost serene, as they spoke. "If you're seeing this, it means I've been forced to move ahead of schedule. The truth you seek lies in what's to come, not in what you've been told. Trust your instincts, Officers Martinez and Johnson. You're better than the system you serve." The hologram flickered, and the driver's face dissolved into static. A second later, the device powered down completely, leaving the room in silence once more. Rachel's mind raced. How do they know our names? How did they set this up? Mike shook his head, his expression grim. "I don't know, but this is way over our heads." They returned to the main lobby, where the federal agents were regrouping. Carter's sharp eyes locked onto Rachel and Mike as they entered. "What did you find?" he demanded. Rachel hesitated. Every instinct told her not to trust Carter, but withholding information from the feds was a risky move. "An empty evidence room," she said finally, keeping her tone neutral. Carter didn't look convinced, but before he could press further, one of his agents approached. "Sir, we've located a potential signal coming from the station's east perimeter. It could be them." "Move," Carter ordered, leading his team toward the exit. As the agents filed out, Rachel turned to Mike. "We can't let this go." Mike sighed heavily. "And what do you propose we do?" "This isn't just a traffic stop anymore, Rachel. We're in the middle of something big, something dangerous." "That's exactly why we can't just sit back and let them take control," Rachel argued. "They know more than they're letting on, and whoever this driver is, they came to us for a reason." Mike rubbed his temples, clearly torn. "If we dig into this, we're going to put targets on our backs." "Maybe," Rachel said quietly. "But if there's even a chance we're being lied to, don't we owe it to ourselves to find out the truth?" Mike studied her for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "All right. But we do this carefully. No rushing in blind." Rachel felt a flicker of relief. She didn't know where this path would lead, but one thing was certain: the truth was out there, and she wasn't going to stop until she found it. As the night deepened, Rachel and Mike began piecing together what little they knew, their investigation fueled by determination and a growing sense of unease. But just as they started to connect the dots, the phone on Rachel's desk rang. She picked it up, her voice cautious. "Brookhaven PD, Officer Martinez speaking." The line crackled with static, but a faint voice came through, calm, deliberate, and chillingly familiar. "You're running out of time." Rachel's blood ran cold. It was the driver. And they were still one step ahead. Rachel gripped the phone tightly, her knuckles whitening as the driver's voice echoed in her ear. The calmness of their tone contrasted with the storm brewing in her mind. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice firm but edged with frustration. "What do you want from us?" The line went silent for a moment, except for faint static. Then the voice responded, "I don't want anything from you. I want something for you. Answers." Rachel's pulse quickened. "Answers to what?" "To the questions you're too afraid to ask," the driver said cryptically. "But be careful, knowing the truth has a cost." Before Rachel could press further, the line went dead. She pulled the phone away from her ear, staring at it as if it might somehow explain what had just happened. Her mind raced with possibilities. How had the driver managed to call her? Where were they hiding? Mike noticed the look on her face and stepped closer. Who was it? Rachel hesitated before answering. It was them. Mike's eyes widened. What did they say? More riddles, Rachel replied, shaking her head. Something about answers and the cost of knowing the truth. Mike's expression darkened. They're playing games with us. Maybe, Rachel said, her mind working rapidly. Or maybe they're trying to tell us something important. The federal agents were still combing the area outside the station, their flashlights sweeping over empty parking lots and surrounding streets. Agent Carter's sharp voice could be heard barking orders to his team, frustration evident in his tone. Rachel and Mike stood near the station's main desk, keeping their voices low as they discussed their next move. They know too much about us, Mike, Rachel said, her tone urgent. They called me by name, even before we introduced ourselves. They knew to come to this station. Mike nodded grimly. And now they're gone, leaving us to clean up the mess. Rachel glanced around, making sure none of the other officers were listening. We need to figure out who they are before the feds take over completely. They're hiding something big. Mike folded his arms. Where do we even start? We don't have much to go on. Rachel thought for a moment, then her eyes lit up. The cruiser's dashcam. Mike raised an eyebrow. You think they said or did something on the way here that could help? It's worth a shot, Rachel said. If nothing else, we might be able to piece together where they've been or who else might be involved. Mike hesitated, then nodded. Let's do it. But we've got to move fast. If Carter gets wind of this, he'll lock us out of everything. The two officers slipped out of the main lobby and headed to the parking lot, where their cruiser was still parked. Rachel opened the driver's side door and activated the onboard computer, pulling up the dashcam footage from the past few hours. The video loaded, showing the moment they first pulled the driver over. They watched in silence as the footage played. The initial stop seemed routine enough, Rachel and Mike approaching the car, the driver sitting calmly behind the wheel. But as the video continued, something unusual caught Rachel's eye. Wait, she said, pausing the playback. Look at their hands. Mike leaned closer, squinting at the screen. The driver's hands were resting on the steering wheel, perfectly still. Too still. They're not gripping the wheel, Rachel pointed out. They're barely touching it. Mike frowned. That's strange, but it doesn't mean anything. Rachel rewound the footage and played it again, this time focusing on the driver's movements. As the car came to a stop, they glanced in the rearview mirror, then for a split second, their expression shifted. It was subtle, but Rachel caught it. They knew we were watching, she said. Look at the way they check the mirror. It's like they're planning their next move. Mike nodded slowly. So they wanted to be caught. Or they wanted to talk to us specifically, Rachel added. Remember what they said, you've been chosen. Mike leaned back, rubbing his temples. This is getting weirder by the second. Rachel fast-forwarded the footage to their arrival at the station. The driver sat in the back seat, their expression unreadable. But just before they stepped out of the car, they turned their heads slightly, almost as if looking directly at the camera. Pause it, Mike said, pointing at the screen. Rachel froze the frame. The driver's face was clear, their gaze intense, as if they were staring right through the lens. Zoom in, Mike said. Rachel complied, enlarging the image. The closer view revealed something Rachel hadn't noticed before, a faint scar running along the side of the driver's neck, partially hidden by the collar of their jacket. Have you ever seen that before? Rachel asked. Mike shook his head. No, but it could mean something. If we can identify them, maybe we can figure out what's going on. Rachel nodded, her mind racing. We need to dig deeper. This isn't just about who they are, it's about what they know. Before they could discuss their next steps, a loud crash came from inside the station. Rachel and Mike exchanged a quick glance before sprinting back inside, their hands on their weapons. They entered the lobby to find chaos. The federal agents were gathered near the evidence room, shouting over one another. Carter stood at the center of the commotion, his face red with anger. What happened? Rachel demanded. Carter turned to her, his expression livid. The device is gone. Rachel's stomach dropped. Gone? How? Carter gestured to the evidence room, where the door hung open and the shelves were in disarray. Someone broke in. And it wasn't one of us. Mike's eyes narrowed. You think it was the driver? Carter glared at him. Who else would it be? Your department clearly can't handle this. Rachel bristled at the comment, but held her tongue. Her mind was already spinning with possibilities. If the driver had taken the device, it meant they were still close, but how had they managed to slip past everyone? As Carter barked orders at his team, Rachel turned to Mike, her voice low. "They're playing a bigger game than we realized." Mike nodded. "And if we don't figure out the rules soon, we're going to lose." Just then, Rachel's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and stared at the screen. It was a text message from an unknown number. The message was short but chilling. "You're running out of time. Follow the scar." Rachel's grip tightened on the phone as she read the message aloud to Mike. His eyes widened. "The scar. They're telling us how to find them." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. Whoever this person was, they were always one step ahead. And now they were leading her and Mike into what felt like the beginning of something much bigger, and far more dangerous. Rachel stared at the message on her phone, her mind racing. "Follow the scar," she murmured, the words lingering like a puzzle piece that didn't yet fit. She showed the message to Mike, who frowned deeply. "This doesn't make any sense," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "How are they contacting you? And why?" Rachel glanced toward the evidence room, where the federal agents were still combing through the mess. Carter's sharp voice barked orders as his team scoured the area. She lowered her voice. "They want us to figure something out, something the feds don't know or aren't telling us." Mike sighed heavily. "That's what I'm afraid of. Whatever this is, it's bigger than us." Rachel took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "We don't have a choice now. They're leading us somewhere, and if we don't follow, we might lose our only chance to get answers." Mike hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. "All right. Let's figure this out. But we do it our way, carefully. No rushing in blind." The two officers retreated to a quieter corner of the station, away from the federal agents' watchful eyes. Rachel pulled up the dashcam footage again, zooming in on the scar they had noticed earlier. It was faint, barely visible, but its placement, running vertically along the side of the driver's neck, was distinctive. What could it mean? Rachel wondered aloud. It's not just some random injury. They wouldn't mention it if it didn't matter. Mike crossed his arms, deep in thought. Scars can have history. Maybe it's connected to something in their past, a surgery, a fight, an accident. If we can trace it, we might be able to identify them. Rachel nodded, her mind already jumping to possibilities. "I'll check the database for medical records, mugshots, anything that could match that scar." She began typing furiously into her laptop, searching through law enforcement databases and cross-referencing the driver's physical description. Minutes ticked by, and the tension between them grew heavier with each passing second. Finally, Rachel's screen pinged with a match. Her eyes widened as she read the details. "Got something." Mike leaned over her shoulder. "What is it?" The file was a mugshot from years ago. The photo showed a younger version of the driver, their face unmistakable even with subtle differences. The name on the file was different from the one on the ID they'd seen earlier, but the scar was there, fainter, but in the same place. "This can't be right," Rachel muttered, scrolling through the attached records. According to this, they were arrested in Chicago over a decade ago. But the charges were dropped, and they disappeared shortly after. Mike frowned. Disappeared? Like, went off the grid. Rachel nodded. No known address, no employment records, nothing. It's like they vanished. Mike's jaw tightened. And now they show up here, with a new name and the feds breathing down our necks. This isn't just a coincidence. Rachel's phone buzzed again, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat. Another text from the same unknown number. "Go to the diner on 5th Street. Ask for the special." Mike read the message over her shoulder, his face darkening. "This feels like a trap." Rachel nodded slowly. "It might be. But what choice do we have? If they wanted to hurt us, they could have done it already. They're leading us somewhere for a reason." Mike hesitated, then sighed. "All right. But we don't go alone. We'll call for backup." Rachel shook her head. "We can't bring anyone else into this. Not yet. The feds are already all over this, and we don't know who we can trust." Mike gave her a long look, then relented. "Fine. But if this goes sideways, we're getting out of there. No heroics." "Deal," Rachel said, her voice firm. The diner on 5th Street was an old, run-down establishment that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a flickering glow over the cracked pavement outside. Rachel and Mike parked a block away and approached on foot, their senses on high alert. Inside, The atmosphere was quiet and unassuming. A handful of patrons sat in booths, sipping coffee and chatting softly. The smell of fried food and stale coffee filled the air. A waitress in a faded uniform greeted them with a tired smile. "Take a seat anywhere," she said. Rachel shook her head. "We're here for the special." The waitress's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced around as if checking to see who might be watching. "You sure about that?" Rachel nodded. "Positive." The waitress hesitated, then gestured toward the back of the diner. "Booth 7. Wait there." Rachel and Mike exchanged a wary glance before making their way to the indicated booth. The seat was tucked into a shadowy corner, far from the other patrons. As they sat down, Rachel's pulse quickened. The booth felt too private, too deliberate. Minutes passed, and nothing happened. Rachel was about to speak when the waitress returned, carrying a plain white envelope. She placed it on the table without a word, then walked away. Rachel picked up the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. She unfolded it, revealing another message. "The scar leads to the truth. Follow the trail. Start at 819 Westover Lane." Mike frowned. "That's not far from here. What do you think we'll find there?" Rachel's gut churned with unease. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's important enough for them to risk everything to get us involved." As they left the diner, Rachel's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from the station. She hesitated before answering. "Martinez," she said. "Rachel, it's Sergeant Daniels." Her superior's voice crackled through the line. "Where are you?" "We're following up on a lead," Rachel replied, keeping her tone neutral. "Well, you need to get back here." "Now," Daniels said, his voice urgent. "The feds found something, and they're shutting everything down. They're saying this case is bigger than we thought." Rachel exchanged a glance with Mike. "We'll be there soon." She hung up, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they painted was more dangerous than she'd imagined. As she and Mike headed toward Westover Lane, a sense of foreboding settled over her. Whatever awaited them at 819 Westover Lane, it would change everything. Rachel and Mike drove toward 819 Westover Lane, the tension between them palpable. The address led to a quiet residential neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors and unusual activity stood out like a sore thumb. As they turned onto the street, Rachel slowed the cruiser, scanning the house numbers. "There it is," Mike said, pointing to a modest two-story house with a peeling white exterior and an overgrown lawn. The house appeared abandoned. The front porch sagged, the windows were clouded with dust, and the faint glow of a single porch light gave the entire property an eerie vibe. Rachel parked a few houses down, keeping the cruiser out of direct view. "This doesn't feel right," she muttered, shutting off the engine. Mike nodded, his hand instinctively brushing his holster. "Let's stay sharp." They approached the house cautiously, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. The neighborhood was unnervingly silent, save for the soft rustle of wind through the trees. Rachel glanced back at the street, half expecting someone, or something, to be watching them. The front door was slightly ajar, its rusted hinges creaking as it swayed faintly in the breeze. Rachel exchanged a wary glance with Mike, then pushed the door open with her flashlight. The interior was as dilapidated as the exterior, filled with dusty furniture, scattered papers, and the faint scent of mildew. "Hello," Rachel called, her voice steady despite the unease clawing at her. "Brookhaven PD. Is anyone here?" Silence. Mike stepped in behind her, his flashlight sweeping over the walls. "This place hasn't been lived in for years." Rachel nodded, her eyes scanning the room. The papers on the floor caught her attention. She knelt down and picked one up, her brow furrowing as she read the text. "It's a medical file," she said, holding it up for Mike to see. Mike frowned. "A medical file? For who?" Rachel's heart skipped as she read the name at the top, Elliot Grayson. "It's them," she said quietly. "The driver." Mike leaned closer, his face darkening. Why would their medical records be here? Rachel flipped through the file, her stomach tightening with every page. The documents detailed a series of experimental procedures, strange treatments with cryptic names like Project Anvil and Phase 3 neural calibration. Diagrams of surgical implants filled the pages, along with notes from an unidentified doctor. "This isn't just a medical file," Rachel said. "It's some kind of experiment." Mike's face hardened. What the hell were they doing to them? Before Rachel could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere upstairs. Both officers froze, their hands darting to their weapons. "Did you hear that?" Mike whispered. Rachel nodded, rising slowly to her feet. "We're not alone." They moved toward the staircase, their steps careful and deliberate. The old wood creaked under their weight, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. At the top of the stairs, a faint light seeped out from beneath a door. Rachel and Mike exchanged a silent look, their training kicking in. Mike motioned for Rachel to take the lead while he covered her. She nodded, then approached the door, her heart hammering in her chest. She reached out and turned the knob, pushing the door open with her flashlight. Inside was a small, cluttered room, its walls covered in photographs, maps, and newspaper clippings. Strings connected the various items, forming a chaotic web of information. In the center of the room was a desk piled high with papers and a laptop, its screen glowing faintly. But the room wasn't empty. A man stood near the desk, his back to them. He was tall and thin, his dark hoodie pulled up over his head. At the sound of the door opening, he turned slowly, his face partially obscured by shadows. "Don't move," Rachel said, her gun trained on him. "Hands where I can see them." The man raised his hands slowly, his movements deliberate. "You're wasting your time," he said, his voice calm and detached. "They're already gone." "Who's gone?" Rachel demanded. "And who are you?" The man smiled faintly, his expression unnervingly calm. "I'm just the messenger." "Messenger for who?" Mike pressed, stepping closer. The man didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the desk. "Everything you need to know is right there. But you'd better act fast. They don't like loose ends." Before Rachel or Mike could react, the man reached into his pocket. Rachel's finger tightened on the trigger, but before she could fire, the man pulled out a small device and pressed a button. A deafening explosion of light and sound filled the room, blinding them both. Rachel stumbled back, her ears ringing, her vision blurred. By the time the light faded and she regained her bearings, the man was gone. "Damn it!" Mike shouted, coughing as he waved away the lingering smoke. Rachel's flashlight darted around the room, but there was no sign of the man. He had vanished, just like the driver. Rachel turned her attention to the desk, her frustration giving way to determination. She sifted through the papers, her eyes scanning for anything that might make sense of the chaos. Maps of various cities were pinned to the wall, marked with red dots. Newspaper clippings detailed mysterious disappearances, strange sightings, and reports of government cover-ups. One document caught her eye, a handwritten note in the same handwriting as the message from earlier. It read, "Elliot Grayson is only the beginning. Find the others before they do." Rachel's stomach churned as she read the words. She turned to Mike, holding up the note. "This isn't just about them. There are others." Mike shook his head, his expression grim. "Others like Grayson? People who, escaped whatever this is." "Maybe," Rachel said. "Or maybe they're still in it." Mike glanced around the room, his unease growing. "We need to get back to the station. Tell Daniels everything." Rachel hesitated. "If we tell them, the feds will shut us out completely." Mike's jaw tightened. "We can't do this alone, Rachel." She looked back at the note, her mind racing. They were in way over their heads, but something deep inside her refused to let go. Whoever Elliot Grayson was, they were counting on her and Mike to uncover the truth. Finally, she nodded. "Let's go. But we need to move fast." As they left the house, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed deeper, the air heavier. Somewhere out there, Elliot Grayson was still on the run. And the clock was ticking. Rachel and Mike drove back toward the station, the weight of what they had discovered pressing down on them. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound in the car, neither of them speaking as they processed the night's events. The handwritten note Rachel had found sat on the dashboard, the words etched into her mind. "Elliot Grayson is only the beginning. Find the others before they do." Mike finally broke the silence. "Do you think this they is the feds?" Rachel glanced at him, her grip tightening on the wheel. "Maybe. Or maybe it's something even bigger. Bigger than the feds?" Mike asked, raising an eyebrow. Rachel sighed. "The experiments in those files, they're not normal. They're not something the government would want people knowing about. It feels like someone, or some group, has been covering this up for years." "And Grayson got out," Mike said, piecing it together. Now they're trying to make sure no one finds out. Exactly, Rachel said. And if there really are others like Grayson, they're probably in danger too. Mike leaned back in his seat, rubbing his temples. This just keeps getting worse. When they arrived at the station, the atmosphere was tense. The federal agents had taken over completely, their presence dominating the building. Carter was in the middle of a heated conversation with Sergeant Daniels, his voice carrying across the room. "This is out of your jurisdiction," Carter was saying, his tone sharp. "We're handling this now." Daniels folded his arms, refusing to back down. "This is my station, and those were my officers who brought Grayson in. You don't get to shut us out." "You don't understand what's at stake here," Carter snapped. "This is bigger than Brookhaven PD, bigger than you." Rachel and Mike exchanged a glance. Whatever was happening, it was clear Carter wasn't going to share any more information than he had to. As they approached, Daniels noticed them and motioned them over. "Martinez, Johnson, where the hell have you been?" "We followed a lead," Rachel said, keeping her tone neutral. "We found something." Carter's sharp eyes turned to her. "What kind of lead?" Rachel hesitated, glancing at Mike. She could feel the weight of the note in her pocket, the words burning like a brand in her mind. She knew sharing too much could put their investigation, and their lives, in jeopardy. "An abandoned house," Rachel said finally. "There were some old medical files. Looked like it might be connected to Grayson." Carter's expression didn't change, but Rachel could see the gears turning in his mind. "Where?" 819 Westover Lane, Rachel replied. "But whoever was there is long gone. The place is empty." Carter stared at her for a long moment, then turned to one of his agents. "Send a team to sweep the area." The agent nodded and hurried off, leaving Carter to fix Rachel with an intense gaze. "If you find anything else, you report it to me." "Understood." Rachel nodded, though her stomach twisted at the thought of giving Carter more control. "Understood." After Carter walked away, Daniels pulled Rachel and Mike aside. His expression was a mix of frustration and concern. "What's going on here? The feds are treating this like a national emergency, and you two are out chasing leads on your own." Rachel lowered her voice. "We found more than we told them. Grayson isn't just a suspect. They're part of something much bigger, something dangerous." Daniels frowned. "Bigger how?" Rachel hesitated, then pulled the note from her pocket and handed it to him. Daniels read it, his expression growing darker with each word. Daniels said slowly. "You think it's the feds?" "It could be," Rachel said. "Or it could be something else entirely. Either way, Grayson knows something important. And if we don't figure it out, they're going to disappear again, just like they did tonight." Daniels rubbed his jaw, clearly torn. "You're playing with fire, Martinez. If Carter gets even a hint that you're keeping things from him, he'll shut us down," Rachel finished. "I know. But we can't just let this go. If there are others like Grayson, they could be in danger. We have to do something." Daniels sighed heavily, then nodded. "All right. But you keep me in the loop. And for God's sake, be careful." Later that night, Rachel sat at her desk, staring at the map they had taken from the house. Red dots marked various cities across the country, but there was no clear pattern. She traced the lines with her finger, her mind racing. Mike walked over, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one down in front of her and took a seat. "Any ideas?" Rachel shook her head. "Not yet. But this map means something. These cities, there has to be a connection." Mike leaned over, studying the map. "What about the dates?" Some of the clippings had timestamps on them. Rachel flipped through the papers, her eyes scanning the dates. They were scattered, but one stood out, a series of disappearances in a small town in Montana, all within a 2-week period 3 years ago. "Montana," Rachel said, circling the location on the map. "Whatever happened there, it was big enough to leave a trail." Mike frowned. "You think it's connected to Grayson?" "It has to be," Rachel said. "If we can figure out what happened in Montana, it might give us a clue about the others." Mike nodded. "Then we start there. But we need to move fast. Carter's not going to let us out of his sight for long." As the night wore on, Rachel felt the weight of the case pressing down on her. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she knew one thing for sure: she and Mike were in the middle of something far bigger than they'd ever imagined. And the deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. The station was eerily quiet by the early hours of the morning. Most officers had clocked out, and even the federal agents had thinned in number, though Carter remained, prowling the station like a predator waiting for its prey to slip up. Rachel sat at her desk, the map spread out in front of her. The dots marking different cities across the country seemed to stare back, each one holding a story she couldn't yet see. Mike returned from the break room with another cup of coffee, setting it on the desk beside her. "Montana," he said, sliding into the chair next to her. "What do we know about it?" Rachel flipped through the papers they had retrieved from the abandoned house. One clipping in particular caught her eye. It was an article from a local Montana newspaper, dated 3 years ago. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearances Plague Quiet Town." She read the first few lines aloud. Residents of the small town of Willow Creek have reported a string of unexplained disappearances over the past 2 weeks. Local authorities have declined to comment, but witnesses claim to have seen strange vehicles entering and leaving the area late at night. Mike leaned forward, his brow furrowing. Late-night activity, strange vehicles. That sounds a lot like what we're dealing with now. Rachel nodded. And listen to this part. The disappearances coincide with the sudden closure of the Willow Creek Medical Facility, which had been operational for over 50 years. The hospital's administration has yet to provide a statement. Mike's jaw tightened. A closed medical facility. That's a pattern. Rachel tapped the clipping. Elliot Grayson's medical records mentioned experiments. What if these disappearances are connected to those experiments? What if that hospital was a testing ground? Mike sighed, leaning back in his chair. If that's true, then this is bigger than anything we've ever dealt with. And if Carter's involved, he knows a hell of a lot more than he's letting on. Rachel looked over her shoulder, ensuring Carter wasn't lurking nearby. She lowered her voice. "We need to get to Montana. If the answers are there, we can't afford to wait." Mike raised an eyebrow. "You want to just pick up and leave? You think Carter's going to let us walk out of here?" Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't ask. We just go." The plan came together quickly. They decided to leave under the guise of following a local lead, one innocuous enough to not raise suspicion. Rachel logged the trip into the station system, citing a minor break-in across town that required follow-up. It wasn't foolproof, but it would buy them time. Rachel packed her notes, the map, and the clippings into a folder. Mike grabbed their cruiser keys, glancing nervously toward Carter's office. "If we're doing this, we need to move now. Carter's going to notice the second we're gone." Rachel nodded, her heart pounding as they walked toward the exit. Every step felt like it could be their last before being stopped. The cool night air hit her face as they stepped outside, the quiet streets of Brookhaven stretching out before them. The cruiser sat waiting at the curb. "Let's go," Rachel said, climbing into the driver's seat. Mike slid into the passenger seat, and they pulled out of the lot, heading for the highway. Rachel kept her eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting black SUVs to materialize behind them at any moment. But the streets remained empty. "We're really doing this," Mike said after a few minutes of silence. Rachel nodded, gripping the wheel. "We don't have a choice. If we stay, Carter shuts us down, and we lose everything. If we go, we might have a chance." Mike exhaled sharply. "Let's hope you're right." The drive to Montana was long and tense. They stopped only for gas and to swap driving shifts, speaking little as the hours passed. Both of them were on edge, watching for signs of pursuit, but no one followed them. By the time they reached Willow Creek, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale orange glow over the town. It was as quiet and unassuming as the article had described: quaint houses, a single diner, and a general store. But there was an undercurrent of something darker, something hidden beneath the surface. Rachel parked the cruiser near the diner, and they stepped out, stretching their legs after the long drive. A few locals were milling about, but they barely spared the two officers a glance. "We need to find that medical facility," Rachel said. "If it's still standing, it might have answers." Mike pointed toward an older man sitting on a bench outside the general store. "Maybe he knows something." The man looked up as they approached, his weathered face creasing into a cautious smile. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "Morning," Rachel replied, keeping her tone friendly. "We're looking for the old Willow Creek Medical Facility. Do you know where it is?" The man's smile faltered slightly. "Why you want to go pokin' around there? Ain't been nothin' there in years." "We're investigating a case," Rachel said carefully. "It might be connected to what happened there." The man eyed them warily, then sighed. It's out past the edge of town, near the woods. You'll see the old sign for it, though it's probably half fallen over by now. But I'm telling you, there's nothing left there. Just rubble. Rachel nodded. Thank you. As they headed back to the cruiser, Mike glanced at her. Rubble or not, we need to see it. The road to the medical facility was narrow and overgrown, the trees pressing in on either side. Rachel drove slowly, her eyes scanning for any sign of the old building. Finally, they came upon the sign, faded and leaning, but still legible, Willow Creek Medical Facility. They parked the cruiser and stepped out, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The building itself was little more than a crumbling shell, its walls cracked and its windows shattered. Nature had begun reclaiming it, vines crawling up the sides and grass sprouting through the cracks in the pavement. This place gives me the creeps, Mike muttered, his hand resting on his holster. Rachel nodded. Let's check it out. They stepped through the broken front doors, their flashlights cutting through the dim interior. The air was heavy and still, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. Papers and debris littered the floor, and old medical equipment lay abandoned, rusted and broken. Rachel's flashlight landed on a set of stairs leading down. Basement, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mike hesitated. You sure about this? No, Rachel admitted. But we're here. They descended the stairs slowly, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, they found a heavy steel door, slightly ajar. Rachel pushed it open, revealing a large, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with cages. Rachel's stomach dropped as she realized they weren't for animals, they were human-sized. Most were empty, but a few contained rusted restraints, long since abandoned. Medical equipment was scattered around, along with file cabinets and monitors. What the hell happened here? Mike breathed. Rachel moved to one of the cabinets, pulling it open. Inside were rows of files, each labeled with a name. She pulled one out and flipped through it, her heart sinking with every page. Experimentation, she said quietly. They were using people as test subjects. Mike moved to a nearby monitor, brushing dust off the screen. It flickered to life, displaying a single word. Welcome. Before they could react, the steel door slammed shut behind them. A loud click echoed, locking them inside. Rachel and Mike exchanged panicked glances as the monitor screen changed, displaying a countdown. 10 minutes. What the hell is this? Mike shouted, rushing to the door and yanking at the handle. Rachel stared at the screen, her pulse racing. It's a trap. Rachel's heart pounded as she stared at the countdown ticking down on the screen. 9:59. 9:58. The red numbers glowed ominously in the dim room, each second a reminder that time was slipping away. Mike banged on the heavy steel door, his voice rising. We've got to get out of here. This door's not budging. Rachel forced herself to think past the panic gripping her. The cages, the equipment, the files, everything in this room pointed to the same horrifying conclusion. This was where Elliot Grayson, and possibly others, had been subjected to whatever twisted experiments were documented in the files. Now, they were trapped in the same place. She scanned the room for anything useful, her flashlight beam jumping from corner to corner. Check the walls, she said urgently. There might be another exit. Mike began feeling along the cold concrete walls, searching for seams or hidden panels. Meanwhile, Rachel turned her attention to the monitors. The countdown continued to tick away, and she knew they didn't have time to waste. 9:12. 9:11. She clicked through the options on the monitor, desperate for a clue. Files, schematics, logs. None of it seemed to offer immediate help. Then, a folder labeled Emergency Protocols caught her eye. She opened it and found a map of the facility's basement. There, marked faintly in the corner, was a note, Secondary Exit, Storage Room B. Mike, she called, pointing to the map. There's another way out. Storage Room B, it's on the other side of the basement. Mike's flashlight swept across the far end of the room, where a narrow hallway led into darkness. Let's go, he said, his voice tight with urgency. The hallway was long and suffocating, the air heavy with dust and the faint metallic tang of rusted metal. Their footsteps echoed eerily, blending with the relentless ticking of the countdown still visible on the monitors behind them. 7:45. 7:44. Rachel's flashlight illuminated faded signs on the walls, most too worn to read. But eventually, one stood out, Storage room B. This is it, Rachel said, pushing the door open with her shoulder. The hinges groaned, and the door resisted slightly before swinging inward. The room was cluttered with old medical equipment, shelves filled with boxes, and a few toppled filing cabinets. In the corner, a faint red glow marked what looked like an emergency exit panel. There. Mike shouted, moving toward it. But as he stepped forward, something shifted in the shadows. A figure emerged from behind one of the shelves, and Rachel's blood ran cold. It was a man gaunt, pale, and dressed in tattered hospital scrubs. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt, and his movements jerky, almost inhuman. "Stop," Rachel commanded, drawing her weapon. "Hands where I can see them." The man didn't respond. Instead, he let out a low guttural sound, his head twitching unnaturally. He took a step closer, his bony fingers curling as if reaching for them. Mike raised his gun. "Rachel, he's not stopping. Stay back." Rachel shouted again, her voice firm. The man lunged. Mike fired, the sound deafening in the small room. The figure staggered back, but didn't fall. Instead, it straightened, a strange guttural growl escaping its lips. Blood seeped from a wound in its shoulder, but it seemed unfazed. "What the hell is that?" Mike yelled, backing up. Rachel's mind raced. This wasn't a normal person. Whatever had happened in this facility had turned this man into something else. Her eyes darted to the emergency exit panel behind the creature. It was their only way out. "We have to get past him," she said, her voice trembling but determined. The creature lunged again, faster this time. Rachel fired, hitting its chest, and Mike followed with another shot. The creature dropped to its knees, letting out a pained groan before collapsing. Rachel didn't wait to see if it would get back up. She grabbed Mike's arm and pulled him toward the panel. "Come on." The emergency exit panel was old and rusted, its paint peeling. A keypad blinked faintly beneath the red light. Rachel groaned. "Of course it's locked." Mike cursed under his breath. "We don't have time for this." 4:32. 4:31. Rachel frantically examined the keypad. There was no hint of a code anywhere on it or nearby. "Check the room," she said. "There might be something, anything." Mike began tearing through drawers and overturned boxes, searching for a clue. Meanwhile, Rachel tried random combinations, but the keypad beeped in denial with each failed attempt. "Rachel," Mike called, holding up a crumpled piece of paper he'd found in a drawer. "This might be it." Rachel snatched the paper from his hands. Scrawled across it in messy handwriting was a sequence of numbers, 97312. She punched the numbers into the keypad, holding her breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then with a loud click, the door unlocked and swung outward, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel. Rachel didn't hesitate. "Let's go." The tunnel was damp and claustrophobic, the sound of dripping water echoing through the space. They ran, their flashlights bobbing wildly as they navigated the uneven ground. Behind them, a faint rumble began to grow, as if the facility itself was coming to life, or falling apart. 1:15. 1:14. Rachel's lungs burned as they pushed forward, desperate to escape. Finally they saw it, a faint light at the end of the tunnel. They burst out into the open air, collapsing onto the ground just as a deafening explosion rocked the earth. Rachel turned back to see a plume of smoke and fire rising from the facility. The blast rattled the trees, sending birds scattering into the sky. Rachel's chest heaved as she struggled to catch her breath. Mike lay beside her, staring at the sky, his face pale and covered in sweat. "That," he said, his voice shaky, "was way too close." Rachel nodded, unable to speak. Her mind raced with questions. What had happened in that facility? What had been done to the people inside? And why had they been lured there, only to be nearly killed? Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps. She tensed, reaching for her weapon, but when she turned, there was no one there. Just the rustling of the trees. "Let's get out of here," Rachel said, her voice firm. "We need to figure out what's really going on." Mike nodded, and together, they started back toward their cruiser. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching them. As Rachel and Mike trudged back to the cruiser, the air seemed heavier, thick with lingering tension and the acrid smell of smoke from the explosion. Every shadow felt alive, every rustle in the underbrush a potential threat. Rachel couldn't help but glance over her shoulder every few steps, her fingers brushing against the grip of her weapon. When they finally reached the car, they both hesitated. Mike leaned against the hood, his breathing still unsteady, while Rachel stood a few feet away, staring back at the direction they'd come from. "That wasn't just some random trap," Mike said finally, breaking the silence. "Someone wanted us dead. Badly." Rachel nodded, still scanning the tree line. "And I don't think they're done with us." Mike sighed, running a hand over his face. "We should have never come here. Whatever this is, we're in over our heads." Rachel turned to face him, her jaw tightening. "You saw what I saw in there. Those people, the experiments, the cages. If we don't figure this out, it's going to keep happening." Mike didn't argue. Instead, he opened the car door and slid into the passenger seat. "All right. Let's figure it out. But first, let's get the hell out of this town before someone else decides to finish the job." Rachel nodded, climbing into the driver's seat. She started the engine, the low hum of the cruiser breaking the eerie silence. As they pulled onto the road, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting another black SUV to materialize behind them. The drive back to town was quiet, the weight of the night's events pressing down on both of them. Rachel replayed everything they had seen and heard, the experiments, the files, the countdown, the creature in the storage room. None of it added up, yet it all pointed to something massive and sinister. When they reached the small motel they'd checked into earlier, Rachel parked the cruiser in the shadows near the back. They entered their room cautiously, their nerves still on edge. Mike locked the door and double-checked the windows before sitting on the edge of the bed. "So what now?" Rachel set her bag on the table and pulled out the map, spreading it across the surface. She circled the town of Willow Creek, the red marker standing out starkly against the faded paper. "This town is just one piece of the puzzle," she said, her voice resolute. "There are other dots on this map, other places where things like this might have happened. If we follow the trail, we might be able to figure out who's behind it." Mike leaned back, his arms crossed. "And what do we do if it leads back to the feds? You think Carter's just going to let us expose this?" Rachel hesitated. "I don't know. But we can't just stop. Grayson came to us for a reason. They trusted us to do something." Mike shook his head. "And look where that's gotten us. Nearly blown up in some basement lab with God knows what chasing us. We're not heroes, Rachel." "No, we're not," Rachel said firmly. "But we're the only ones who know enough to stop this. And if we don't, more people are going to end up like Grayson, or worse." Mike stared at her for a long moment, then let out a resigned sigh. "All right. I'm in. But if we're doing this, we need to be smart. No more walking into traps." Rachel allowed herself a small smile. "Deal." The next morning, Rachel woke to the sound of her phone buzzing. She sat up, blinking at the harsh sunlight streaming through the motel curtains. Mike was still asleep, his jacket draped over his face to block out the light. Rachel grabbed her phone and checked the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. "You're closer than you think. The key is in the files. Don't let them catch you." Her heart skipped a beat. She immediately scanned the room, her paranoia flaring. How did they know where they were? Who was sending these messages? "Mike," she said, nudging him awake. "We've got another message." Mike groaned, pulling the jacket off his face. "What now?" Rachel handed him the phone, and he read the text, his expression darkening. "Great. Now we're being stalked too." "They said the key is in the files," Rachel said, grabbing her bag and pulling out the documents they had taken from the abandoned house. "There's something in here we missed." Mike rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the lingering grogginess. "Let's go through them again. Maybe there's a clue buried somewhere." The next hour was spent combing through every page of the files. Most of it was medical jargon and procedural notes, but something caught Rachel's eye on the last page of Grayson's file. Scribbled in the margin was a series of numbers, 04231989. "Look at this," Rachel said, pointing to the numbers. Mike leaned over. "A date? April 23, 1989. Rachel nodded. "Maybe. Or it could be a code." She opened the laptop they had brought with them and typed the numbers into the search bar, paired with the words Willow Creek and medical facility. A few results popped up, but one in particular caught her attention, a declassified government report titled Project Anvil, Preliminary Trials. Rachel clicked the link, but the page was locked behind a password. She stared at the login screen, frustration bubbling up inside her. "It has to be the date," Mike said. "Try it." Rachel typed in 04231989 and hit enter. The screen flickered, and the document opened. "What the hell?" Mike muttered as they began scrolling through the report. The document detailed a secret government program aimed at developing enhanced human capabilities through experimental procedures. The trials had started at Willow Creek Medical Facility, but had expanded to other locations after complications arose. The final section of the report was heavily redacted, but one line stood out. Subjects who failed to integrate underwent reclassification and termination. Remaining subjects were transferred to undisclosed sites for further monitoring. Rachel's blood ran cold. They weren't just experimenting on people. They were creating, what, superhumans? Soldiers. Mike's face darkened. And the ones who didn't survive, reclassification. They were killed. Rachel leaned back, the weight of the revelation sinking in. This is why the feds are so desperate to shut us down. If this gets out. Mike nodded grimly. It would be the end of them. Before they could discuss their next move, there was a loud knock at the door. Both of them froze, their eyes locking. "Room service," a voice called, too cheerful to be convincing. Rachel's heart raced. "We didn't order anything." Mike moved to the window, peeking through the curtains. His face went pale. "It's not room service. It's them." Rachel grabbed the files and stuffed them into her bag. "We've got to go. Now." Mike nodded, grabbing his gun. "Back door. Let's move." As they slipped out of the motel room and into the alley behind it, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The feds, or whoever was after them, were closing in, and the truth they had uncovered was more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. But there was no turning back now. They had to keep going, no matter the cost. Rachel and Mike sprinted through the narrow alley behind the motel, the sound of heavy boots and muffled shouts closing in behind them. Every instinct screamed at Rachel to keep moving, even as her lungs burned and her mind raced. The files in her bag felt like a ticking time bomb, a dangerous truth that everyone seemed willing to kill for. "Car's too far." Mike panted, glancing over his shoulder. "We need another way out." Rachel scanned the area desperately. Ahead, a chain-link fence separated the alley from the wooded lot behind the motel. "Over there," she shouted, pointing toward it. They reached the fence and scrambled over it, Rachel's heart pounding as she heard the voices behind them grow louder. By the time they hit the ground on the other side, she could hear the distinct crackle of radios and Carter's sharp, commanding tone. "Fan out." They can't have gone far. The forest ahead was dense, the shadows of the towering trees swallowing them as they ran. Branches snagged at their clothes, and the uneven ground made every step treacherous, but Rachel didn't dare stop. They finally slowed after what felt like hours, their breath ragged, their clothes damp with sweat and dew. Rachel leaned against a tree, clutching the straps of her bag as she tried to collect her thoughts. "What now?" Mike asked, his voice low. "We can't outrun them forever." Rachel nodded, her mind working rapidly. "We need to get this out. The files, the project, they need to see the light of day. If we go down, at least the truth won't." Mike frowned. "And how do you suggest we do that? The feds will intercept anything we send, and we don't even know who we can trust." Rachel stared at the bag in her hands, her jaw tightening. Then, an idea sparked. "Grayson trusted us for a reason. Maybe they left more breadcrumbs." Mike raised an eyebrow. "You think Grayson was playing the long game? Why else would they send us those messages?" Rachel said. "They knew the risks, but they still let us hear." Mike considered her words for a moment, then sighed. "All right. Let's find a way to lose them for good first. Then we figure out where to go." They stumbled upon an old hunting cabin deep in the woods. It was small and dilapidated, but it offered a temporary reprieve. Rachel and Mike moved cautiously inside, securing the doors and windows as best they could. The faint light of dawn filtered through the cracked shutters, illuminating the dust motes that hung in the stale air. Rachel pulled out the files and spread them across the rickety table. She flipped through the documents, searching for anything that might lead them to the next step. "There," Mike said, pointing to a page near the bottom. It was a partially redacted letter addressed to an anonymous whistleblower, offering instructions for securing evidence related to Project Anvil. The letter mentioned a location, a secure drop point in Denver, Colorado. Rachel's eyes widened. This is it. This is where Grayson wanted us to go. Mike leaned over the map. Denver's a long way from here. And you can bet Carter's got people watching every major road between here and there. We'll figure it out, Rachel said firmly. This is our only shot. The journey to Denver was fraught with tension. They swapped cars twice, paying cash for beat-up sedans from disinterested sellers who asked no questions. They avoided major highways, sticking to back roads and small towns to stay off the grid. Every gas station stop felt like a potential ambush, every passing car a threat. Rachel barely slept, her mind running on adrenaline and the ever-present fear of being caught. But the files in her bag kept her going. They represented not just the truth, but a chance to expose the horrors of Project Anvil and save others who might still be trapped. When they reached Denver, Rachel and Mike followed the instructions from the letter to the drop point, a storage unit on the outskirts of the city. The place was deserted, its rows of metal doors stretching endlessly under the dim glow of overhead lights. This is it, Rachel said, her voice trembling as they approached the designated unit. She entered the code provided in the letter, and the door rolled up with a metallic groan. Inside was a small desk with a computer, a stack of blank envelopes, and a single USB drive. Rachel plugged the USB drive into the computer, her hands shaking. A message appeared on the screen. Upload evidence. Truth will follow. She began scanning the documents and uploading them, each file a damning piece of the puzzle. The screen flashed green as the uploads completed, one by one. When the final document was uploaded, the screen displayed a single word: delivered. Rachel leaned back, exhaling a shaky breath. It's done. Mike nodded, but his face was grim. We've got a problem. Rachel turned to see headlights cutting through the dark, growing closer. A convoy of black SUVs screeched to a stop outside the storage unit, their doors flying open. Carter stepped out first, his expression cold and furious. Get your hands up, he barked, his weapon drawn. Agents surrounded them in seconds, guns trained on Rachel and Mike. Rachel raised her hands, her heart pounding, but she held Carter's gaze. It's over, she said, her voice steady. The files are out. You can't bury this anymore. Carter's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening on his weapon. For a moment, it seemed like he might pull the trigger. Then, he lowered the gun, his expression hardening. You just signed your death warrant. Rachel and Mike were arrested and taken into custody, but the files had already begun spreading. Within days, leaked documents and whistleblower reports appeared online, triggering a media frenzy. The truth about Project Anvil, and the atrocities committed in its name, captivated the nation. Public outrage mounted, and investigations into the program began. Rachel and Mike, though held in a secure facility, became symbols of courage in the face of corruption, their names synonymous with the fight for accountability. Months later, a journalist managed to send Rachel a message during a rare visit. The world knows now. You were right. Grayson's trail saved lives. Sitting alone in her cell, Rachel allowed herself a small smile. The battle wasn't over, but the truth was finally out. And for the first time, she felt hope that justice would prevail.